Welcome to the Clarice Smith Distinguished Lecture Series. It's an opportunity to offer new insights in American art as we welcome the perspectives of noted artists, critics, and scholars. I might mention that Clarice Smith, who funds this program, is an artist herself, as well as an Emerita Commissioner of the Smithsonian American Art Museum, and we're so grateful for her ongoing support. I'm delighted to introduce you to noted scholar, Dr. Jolene K. Rickard. She currently is an associate professor in the Department of Art History and American Indian and Indigenous Studies at Cornell University. There, she also serves as the director of the American Indian and Indigenous Studies program. She is the proud granddaughter of Tuscarora Chief Clinton Rickard. She's also an artist as well and has worked in photography, which she sees as linked to the manipulations of light and texture and representations of cosmological space and spirituality of earlier generations of Iroquois beadwork artists. I'm happy to note that she has also worked with our sister institution, the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian, on their permanent exhibit, Our Peoples and Our Lives.
I'd like to recognize and thank the Smithsonian American Art Museum and the director, Stephanie Stevish, and all museum professionals for the heavy lifting they consistently do to support the arts, and specifically my respected colleagues throughout the Smithsonian network. I had the opportunity to be a sort of insider at the formation of the National Museum of the American Indian and remain connected as an intermittent consultant. My more recent affiliation with SAAM is as an editorial board member of American Art, the leading peer-reviewed journal of American art history and related visual culture. This is a rewarding experience because of the engaging board discussions led by the journal's editor, Robin Vetter. Thanks to Kaylee Bryant-Greenwell for the invitation to give the 2020 Clarice Smith Distinguished Lecture in American Art. And a very special thanks to Gloria Kenyon and to Thomas Stettel and his dedicated colleagues who provide technical support for events like this to happen seamlessly during the time of the pandemic. Sometimes unknowing colleagues pose seemingly innocent questions about how one justifies thinking, writing, researching, and making art when there are so many issues for Indigenous peoples. What most fail to recognize is that the process of creativity is central to the ongoing formation of Indigenous customary practices, identity, and governing structures. Therefore, the very issues faced by Indigenous peoples are being contemplated through the process of making with multiple strategies. Indigenous art is on the global stage in established and radically emergent exhibitions, and also receiving attention within most Indigenous communities. I use the idea of community as a strategy to remap the complex Indigenous and settler state geospatial ongoing negotiations. I follow the art, and it informs me that Indigenous people are deeply engaged with our philosophic centers, continuously rejecting colonizing actions, recalibrating our teachings in contemporary terms, and setting Indigenous priorities. In total, we have appropriated the word sovereignty early in the 20th century and made it uniquely Indigenous. Why bring up sovereignty? Because Indigenous artists are grappling with what structures we need within our communities to maintain customary practices as relevant in our lives today. The common adage of think globally, act locally has a different inflection within Indigenous perspective. Indigenous philosophic and historic formations are based on sustained observations of the biome, environment, and space over thousands of years. The language that environmentalists and indigenous peoples use to describe this practice is place-based knowledge. Therefore, to fully unlock or understand customary practices or traditions, indigenous artists translate their sustained observations and connect it through a material expression or analysis. Are all indigenous artists engaging in this methodology? The artists that I'm interested in most certainly spring from this well. But one definite position that I find in dialogue with a broad range of indigenous aesthetic practitioners is that their ardent resistance to being hemmed in or categorized. But isn't this true for all artists? By letting the aesthetic object lead, regardless if it is a pre-contact pop or an expression in digital media, one must approach this work with movement. Art and visual historians that work in intercultural with intersectional research methodologies understand the multiple louvers in play to contextualize and discuss indigenous art. What are the expectations of or insights one needs beyond any formal analysis of art demands as it applies to indigenous art? The title of the lecture this evening, Haudenosaunee and Indigenous Art as a Marker of Survivance, Resurgence, and Resistance through Co-Creation and Collaboration, will attempt to tease out connective entry points. The Anishinaabe literary scholar Gerald Visner's work in the early 1990s, application of the word survivance, and his subsequent term transmotion, pushed open and create an indigenous theorization of active resistance and rejection to the construction of victimhood. The emergence of the idea of resurgence coincided with a return and investment in indigenous knowledge and customary practices. Indigenous women, and specifically, it is artists invested in learning to skin animals, tan hides, gather grasses, use natural dyes, and all of the skills necessary to make the everyday and ceremonial objects that contain these traditions. Sometimes the results are things that closely resemble earlier embodied expression of cosmological telling, and sometimes they are a conflation of ancient signals as digital data. The idea of resistance is a consistent stance as an indigenous person, always patrolling what is ours, what isn't, and if we want it for our children. In this case, resistance in an art world context is my focus. The reception of art as having importance within communities, as well as speaking to collectors. Resisting the marketplace as the only measure of success. Seeing art as a site of common ground while resisting narrow aesthetic evaluation based on imposed cultural preferences. And perhaps the most significant is the practice of co-creation as a curatorial and creative process. The resistance of art as the celebration only of individualism. There are many exhibitions that demonstrate these ideas over the past century. My journey began in the Lower East Side in New York City in the early 1980s. There's a longer backstory, but the significant moment happened in my apartment with Jean Quick-to-See Smith, combing through a box of my negatives and photographs, asking me why I haven't put together an exhibition. The bigger moment with Jean was Jean's collaboration with Harmony Hammond and Erin Younger to curate Women of Sweetgrass, Cedar, and Sage in 1984. Every time I mention this exhibition, which has been called the first all Native women's exhibition, Someone tells me about an exhibition that occurred in California or Oklahoma or Toronto that was also first. What this reveals is that we need a more exhaustive analysis of the types of exhibitions and their curatorial objectives from the late 70s forward. But women of Sweetgrass, Cedar, and Sage felt different because it was in New York City, in Soho, across the street from Mary Boone's gallery. Curators like Candace Hopkins, Leanne Martin, W. Jackson Rushing, artist and curator Gerald McMaster, Janet Berlow, Jessica Horton, and other scholars have traced the cosmopolitan aspect of Indigenous art in a global context. Richard Hill is putting a fine point on the robust Indigenous artistic activity in North America in the 20th century. So the work is being done, but the particular aspect of co-creation and collaborative curating is at the center of a methodology I argue as Indigenous. I realize feminist practitioners, like the example of women of Sweetgrass, Cedar, and Sage, might think the broader umbrella is feminism, but the philosophic and knowledge formations of Indigenous peoples cannot be subsumed within only that space. So we need to own it. It isn't discreetly Indigenous, but it does need to be centered in Indigenous thought. From women of Sweetgrass, Cedar, and Sage, I felt confident that basket making is an art. For example, baskets and beadwork were set in dialogue with Kay Walking Stick's interpretive landscape paintings and as an illustration of this idea. But there are many more examples. Another example of co-creation and collaboration was based on a chance meeting in a sushi restaurant in New York City after a college art association panel. The esteemed scholar Ruth Phillips invited me to lunch. I picked a sushi restaurant, she agreed, and it was only later that I learned she's not fond of raw fish. But from that meeting and approximately 7 years of research with 3 major museums and 2 Haudenosaunee communities, Across Borders, Beadwork and Iroquois Life was mounted and ran from 1999 to 2002. The perspective I gained from working with a 5-person collaborative curatorial team was the critical engagement with makers. As curators, we made it a priority to raise funds to be able to travel and make available significant archives to community-based beadworkers and artists. The shift from earlier models of scholar-artist relationships gave way to artists and scholars both forming theories on what historic beadwork represents and how it was made. Again, not the only exhibit to foreground this methodology, but I would argue important because it elevated the role of beadwork in Haudenosaunee lives. After Across Borders, the prominence of beadwork as a canonical Indigenous expression globally has exploded. Perhaps a culmination of a number of curatorial collaborations, another exceptional teaching opportunity happened with my role as a curatorial advisor for the exhibition Hearts of Our People, Native Women Artists. Support media accompanying this exhibition informs the audience how important it was for the primary curators, Jill Albert Yohe, garnering institutional support from the Minneapolis Museum of Art, Terry Greaves, acknowledging that the exhibition could not be done without advisors from multiple Indigenous perspectives, and the stealth guidance of Dakota Haska to remind and innovate on local Lakota protocols. But it was the curatorial advisor group that provided a wide glimpse into the resurgence of Indigenous people through co-creation and curation. The range of entry points into Indigenous history and foundational or origin knowledge is witnessed in and throughout the exhibition. Although broader organizational themes are used, I refer to the example of the Iroquois pot and the Santa Clara Pueblo artist Roxanne Swinsel's ceramic sculpture, the Nap, as only one of dozens of examples to focus on the possibility of access to Indigenous perspectives embedded within this work. Mohawk scholar Sue Hill discusses in her award-winning book, The Clay We Are Made Of, the connection between the Haudenosaunee creation story known as Earth Grasper and the formation of human beings from the earth or clay. Hopi fiber artist Ramona Sikisawa commented that Indigenous people are thinking about science and technology, but are often only seen as only picking berries. A similar response has been articulated by Mohawk clan mother from Akwesasne, Louise McDonald, and her relatives, that the Haudenosaunee creation story is about the biological formation of human life as coming from a woman in connection with the life-giving forces of this earth. Another Mohawk scholar, Amber Adams, argues that the creation story is about biological succession. The point being that the pot made of clay is a profound reminder about the physical connections that humans have with the planet. It is both a container, but it also is made of the same elements humans are made of. Swinsel's Nap reconfirms the human-to-human connection in gentle, enveloping gestures, allowing us to feel the breath between the mother and child. The surface of the nap evokes the desire to touch and be touched intimately, lovingly, and it is also a safe harbor for pushing against a strong, steady body. This is art. It calls our attention to our human desire and vicariously filling the void many feel today, the need to be held. How could Swinsel have known how this work would be understood in a moment when so many cannot exchange a simple hug? But it is the intersection between the gendered space of a woman's body, the cosmological underpinnings of Indigenous knowledge, and the material in which we are formed, this earth or clay, that encompasses the depth of this singular piece. But it is reflective of every artwork, both history and it is reflective of every artwork, both historical and contemporary, in hearts of the people. The co-creation collaboration brought these two objects into the exhibition and provides a revised constellation of Indigenous knowledge if one is willing to think fluidly beyond defined Western tenets of aesthetic and linear time. The exhibition featured approximately 53 artists that could be identified, but it also incorporated over 33 works that, like the pot, only have a location as the attribution. But in total, over 87 aesthetic objects of art were curated into hearts of the people. And this is the curatorial board for Hearts of the People and some of the artists that are part of this community. So you can see it's just it represents a group of people from across North America, and it certainly was a rewarding experience to be a part of this exhibition as part of co-creation and collaboration. Contemplation is a part of most artistic practices. But with Indigenous art, I also recognize that the level of expertise in producing well-executed statements cannot be denied. Learning to make things teaches patience and careful looking. It's in our DNA, it's who we are, caught my interest because of the complicated relationship Indigenous peoples have with factionalized and imposed identity policing as part of colonizing structures, with the reference to the double helix or DNA strand on the front lapel of the Osage wedding jacket. Choctaw Chickasaw curator and artist Heather Atone described the piece as, quote, having a meaningful history within the Osage community, representing the fusion of American military coats with Osage matrimonial acts of reciprocity, unquote. And so the discussion about DNA in Indigenous communities is one of the things that is resurfaces consistently. But the idea that Indigenous peoples are deeply invested in understanding how this world was formed and our places on it is a continuation of the discussion of place-based knowledge. And so, but it's also about protocol. Indigenous peoples have been involved in North America intra-protocol, in that protocol between Indigenous communities, but there's also the representation here of a representation of the two-row wampum or Goswenta by the Native Roots Artists Guild, which is located in Haudenosaunee territories, in commemoration of a 400-year-old peace treaty between, we think, between Mohawk and the Mohawk people and the Dutch, as Mohawk is representative of the Haudenosaunee. And so this particular two-row was unfurled really ceremoniously in front of the United Nations after a Canoe reenactment from Haudenosaunee, the heart of Haudenosaunee territories at Onondaga, all through a series of lakes and rivers to come down the Hudson River to arrive in New York and to march across the island of Manhattan to the United Nations to begin to reaffirm our role as both nation as well as looking at the space of Indigenous diplomacy. And so the idea of both the two-row is a very established idea within, I think, not only Indigenous communities, but in allied communities in North America. And it's swiftly becoming a global symbol as well. But my latest contemplation is actually in the location that I'm in. And so typically when I give a lecture, I spend a great deal of time talking about recognition of territory. And so it feels really different because this is an electronic online interaction, yet we're all located in specific places. And so right now I'm talking to you from the Tuscarora Nation. Our actual lecture is coming from Washington, DC, and the place that I work is at Cornell University, which is Canoe or Cayuga territory. And so this idea that we have to recognize the peoples on whose land we're situated is part of this recognition of territory. And so there's a large debate around this in Indian country that is just a performative act. But I can tell you recently, there have been a number of colleagues who have embraced this idea. And the beginning of the movement it's very established in Commonwealth countries, but in the United States, it's less so. And so the idea of recognizing that Indigenous peoples in North America are still present, but have an ancient and very deep tie to this place is, I think, what is at, in part, the reason that it's important to create this recognition. And so in the case of the Gaekono or the Cayuga, the recognition, I would argue, is even more significant because they were forcibly displaced by the Clinton-Sullivan campaign in 1779, and they are now beginning to return to their territory, even though the United States has not recognized their return. And so the irony is that the Cayuga, when they were forcibly displaced from their territory on what many scholars now identify as a burnt earth campaign or a genocide, they sheltered throughout the entire Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And in taking up roots or taking up place in the Six Nations community at Ohsweken, which is just outside of Hamilton, Ontario in Canada, they set about really holding on to the traditional practices of the Haudenosaunee. And so as they began their return to the land of their ancestors, they bring with them one of the most complex and thorough understandings of the ceremonial life of the Haudenosaunee as spoken through the language. And so the retention of languages in our communities is at the heart of our philosophical return. And so we have young people, and I argue young people, but we have people of all ages embracing not only learning how to speak our languages, but also to read the languages in the historic record. For the Haudenosaunee, we have a really thick historic record. And so my collaboration with Steve Henhock, who is Gaekono and a faith keeper, a knowledge holder, is in this case encasing a 700-year-old canoe with etched plexi. And the plexi actually lights up, which is the actual decision to use this material. So there's no like interior lights put on this material. Just because of the way that it was cut, it actually has a very effervescent kind of quality to it. And so this idea of light was very important to this piece because we wanted to talk about both bringing life back to the lake, and the canoe stands in as a metaphor for the lake, the Cayuga Lake. And it's ironic that through the generosity of John Holstein, a colleague and board member for the Otsego Institute, which is dedicated to promoting Native American art history through the Fenimore Cooper Museum in Cooperstown, New York. It's through that association that I met Jonathan Holstein, and it was through his, and it's about dialogue, it's about community, it's about networking. And I was describing to him my ambition that someday, through support at Cornell's Lab of Dendrochronology and the community at Cornell that are ardent environmentalists and interested in sustainability, that we would like to collaborate with the Cayuga to find a log so that they could commence on carving a canoe. And so canoe carving projects are prevalent in the recovery of traditional knowledge across not only North America, but all around the Pacific Rim. And so Jonathan said, well, would you like to see a canoe? And he had this canoe in his possession. He just bought it from the son of, or the grandson of the American anthropologist Frank Speck. And he didn't know what he was going to do with it, but he loaned the canoe so that we actually had a 700-year-old canoe sitting in the center of this very contemporarily executed technology. And the room was actually engulfed with the language of the Cayuga people, intermittent with the songs that they held. One of the things that I'm struck by is that a colleague of mine told me that when the Seneca were being displaced or forced from their territory, they actually, in their communities today, still know the song they sang when they left their community and came further west to uphold the Western door. And so this piece acknowledges the strength of the people, but it also looks at the challenge they faced when their crops were burnt out, and then the process they're involved right now in recovering the land. And so this piece is actually a return, Gaekono return. And the idea of indigenous peoples in some way returning to land is also part of a broad project within indigenous spaces, because so many peoples in our communities were forcibly displaced. And so I recognize that through art, often what we see is a kind of methodology of reclamation through these processes, and certainly in this case. And of course, I couldn't do any of this if it weren't for the support of a young technologist and fellow Tuscarora, Waylon Wilson. And so this is another example of both place-based and community collaboration. And so within this lecture, I started very broadly, and I'm now bringing it very close to home. And that this is a group of beadworkers here at Tuscarora. And Tuscarora actually has a very complex and developed aesthetic relationship to beadworking. Beadwork was actually something that Marlene Printup has been quoted as saying that that she was told by her grandmothers that if you can beadwork, you can do beadwork, you'll never starve. And so there is this kind of practicality amongst indigenous peoples that the ability to make is often equated with the ability to survive financially, to support one's family. And so the translation of complex cosmological ideas into saleable items in order to maintain the space of being able to continue these practices is intricately woven into all of our experiences. And so in this case, The Sky is Darkening is also a contemplation on place-based knowledge. Cornell University has a very famous lab of ornithology, and is actually a repository for taxidermied passenger pigeons who have now gone extinct in the early part of the 20th century. And so the passenger pigeon actually was prolific in the Americas at contact. And the story of the passenger pigeon is simply overhunting because it competed with agriculture. And so the pigeon was actually hunted to extinction. And I thought this was important to think about because it happened within the same century that today we're being warned about this extinction of many different species. And yet here's a physical example. And now we have this archive of taxidermied passenger pigeons that one can look at, but they're taxidermied specimens. And so what do we do with the spirit of that bird? When I spoke with Canoe faith keeper Steve Henhock, and we began to talk about the passenger pigeon, he immediately began to sing pigeon dance songs. And so he has dozens of pigeon dance songs that are part of the social dance aspect for our Haudenosaunee people. And so I thought, well, at Tuscarora, what we do is often we take things that have come out of trauma, that are actually difficult experiences, and we flip it or we turn it into something celebratory. And so the role of birds and all living things actually in our culture are part of how we remind ourselves about our relationships between ourselves as human beings and all other living things. And so I shared this idea with beadworkers from home, including Anita Ferguson, Janice Smith, Annette Printup, Judy Judwer, and Anita Green. And honestly, I could have included another 20, 30, 40 beadworkers. Actually, I could have included hundreds of beadworkers from Haudenosaunee territories. But I worked with a small group at Tuscarora based on family relationships or friendship relationships, or just knowing that they were excellent beadworkers, and asked them if they wanted to participate in this project. My interest is calling attention to the complexity of these forms. And so the staging of the celebratory aspect of our relationship to living things is set against a very dark background. And so the sky is darkening is actually a reference in the historic record to an observation made by a settler in a travel journal that when coming through our territories, there would be moments when there were so many birds that would lift up into the sky that the sky actually turned dark. And so millions of birds would flock in different parts of the territory. And they had a wide range in the Northeast. And so in this case, the notion that the sky is darkening has a very different twist to it, because I'm setting in contrast the actual demise of the pigeon against the ongoing resiliency of the people through their practices, something like beadwork. And in this case, the bird, which is the ubiquitous messenger from this world to the spirit world. And so we have these birds, in a sense, like messengers, not only in this world, but also beyond. And they're covered with very specific use of beads. And so our relationship to applying coverings to things, perhaps it comes from this early kind of respect in the moment of the formation of the Great Law, which is philosophic teaching and structuring of governance for Haudenosaunee people, in a moment when the peacemaker or finds and collects wampum, or what today we refer to as wampum, but the shell is a very important part of Haudenosaunee cosmology. And so one of the things that's difficult to do when talking about a broad topic like Indigenous art is that you have to understand individual cosmological structures in conjunction with the impact of history and colonization. And so if we can think about going deep on understanding individual Indigenous nations And at the same time, you have to learn about Indigenous space more broadly in order to fully understand how each of these things, their materials, the ideas that inform them are situated. And so in this case, the artisan Janice Smith decided to actually bring forward the passenger pigeon's relationship to the American chestnut. And so many of you probably realize, but the American chestnut is failing in the natural world. And in this case, she innovated because the Tuscarora actually have a very developed style of raised beadwork, which we see example on the wing here. But I've never seen this kind of fringe kind of on the tail. And what that represents is the covering of the chestnut before it's taken out of its shell. And then we see the actual chestnuts also in the bird's mouth. And so today there's actually a project to recover the American chestnut, but at one time, the thousands of birds, millions of birds that were flying actually maintained a genetic strength in the actual reproduction of this tree. And so it's about the reciprocal relationships, not only between human beings, but also between us and all other living things, that sometimes scholars like Mohawk Anishinaabe scholar Vanessa Watts is describing through the lens of a more sociological or anthropological based lens of ontology. At the same time, I think it's important to think about the cautionary refusal that Mohawk scholar Audra Simpson puts forward. And there is always this push and pull tension of what gets shared and what is inappropriate to share. And so in this case, the piece that one of my sometime collaborator and also media and digital artist, Waylon Wilson from Tuscarora, has put together, Gayu, Is Anyone There?, is based on this premise where he's bringing forward the kind of beadwork that children learn to make, which we call a jitterbug. And he's setting that in dialogue with the wampum. And the particular wampum that he's setting them in dialogue and setting it in dialogue with is actually the women's nomination belt, which in Mohawk actually means the women raise them up. And so it's actually this belt that recognizes a balance of power within Haudenosaunee structure. It recognizes the authority of women to actually raise up leaders in our communities, but it doesn't suggest that they're not leaders. They are also leaders who are raising up other leaders who in Haudenosaunee territory is defined along gendered lines. And so the affinity or affection or respect for the bead is really deep within our understanding, our way of life. It transgresses those boundaries between the material and the ethereal, or the material and the sentient. And I would argue that if you learn one cultural perspective, an indigenous cultural perspective, you will recognize these ideas in other indigenous cultures. But the struggle is to begin to open up and recognize how these ideas are situated within our cultures. And I think that artwork is actually a great way to be, not just great, but it's a profound entry point. And so in this case, we understand the gravity, the importance of this symbol, And we see in the work of Waylon Wilson the opportunity to understand it not only from the perspective of youth, but that this idea that we're constantly grappling with the past, yet we're very present, and we translate these ideas into the media of our times, but it doesn't mean that we are letting go of the struggle to understand the messages that our grandmothers and grandfathers left for us to be able to live in the future. And so the Haudenosaunee have a vision of 7 generations, looking out for the next 7 generations. And so we think, I recognize that I'm in this world today as a Tuscarora because of all of the generations that brought forward the knowledge that I needed to survive today, while at the same time strategizing what was important and protecting it so that I would actually have a space to be able to contemplate it. And so when I look at the art from all of these experiences, what I recognize is that these artists, these Indigenous artists, are also contemplating these same issues. We're committed to our epistemological formations as Indigenous peoples, and we sometimes make artistic gestures that are actually trying to speak across borders, not only intra-Indigenous borders, but also with, global citizens. And so I think that one of the most important perspectives on Indigenous art in America is that America is Indigenous, and that we need to begin to transform our understanding of what are the Americas, because this is our place in the world. And we are the hosts, and we would like, I would argue, to create a more peaceable space for all of us to live, because we have important work to do. Nyawa, thank you today.
Thank you so much, Jolene. That was really fantastic. I'm going to start with a few questions. One of the things I'd like to ask first is about community and collaboration, which are clearly such an important part of your work and your practice. How do you go about bringing community together with one idea, such as the beads and the beadwork and the birds? How did you bring that group together?
Well, I think that in our community, we do have a process whereby people come together, and it's both first rhetorically. And so when people meet on important issues, often the words before all else, or the Ganonyok is said. And Ganonyok is a reminder of ourselves as human beings and our interconnection to all living things. And so we actually have a formal process that consistently reminds us that we have a responsibility to maintain these relationships. And then when you come from an Indigenous community, one of the things that we recognize is that we've had to really be very conscious about the continual migration of knowledge from one generation to the next, or the intergenerational exchange of knowledge. And so, because we haven't had in the past 500 years the privilege of being empowered at large, but we've had to actually work very hard to maintain what John Mohawk, who is a Seneca scholar and we would say Gehe, that he's passed on, he would talk about this often as an autochthonous center. And so Vine Deloria, who is a Lakota scholar who's also Gehe, passed on, he often referred to this as nations within nations. And more recently, a Mohawk scholar, Dan Longboat, identified Haudenosaunee territories as an archipelago of space, and that we have indigenous spaces located all through the Americas, but that were connected. And so when we bring this to a community perspective, you know, community can mean many things, right? And so in my case, it specifically means people who've been traveling together for a long period of time because we're all Tuscarora. But sometimes I work with communities in urban centers or intra-indigenous communities. So I just want to be sure that, you know, this particular collaboration, I think as you're sensing, was very special because it was with people from my own community. And so one of the things that we practice is the idea of consensus. And so in this case, I brought the idea to the beadworkers, and I asked them if they wanted to participate. And so I didn't know if they would give me permission to set their beadwork in dialogue with my vision, my photograph. And I was lucky that they were willing to do this, but it was only after the entire piece came together that I think that they recognized that how significant their individual contributions were, because I worked with Mary Annette Printup, and she actually put together beadwork kits for me. So we made a pattern so that all the birds would be the same size. So there was, I have to admit, there was like an aesthetic vision that I had. And so this is like the first iteration of this. And I think that, you know, I would like to make more and work with more beadworkers. Beadworking is certainly, I think, a strength at Tuscarora. And now that they, I believe, see this process, I'm hoping that they will be more willing to contribute to the conceptual structure. And so I have to own that the conceptual structure that I brought to this group, but they innovated on the bird. And so it was, that's, in this case, that's how it worked, but it wasn't, but I look forward to actually working with them as more conceptual partners in the future.
Great, thank you. So it really does sound like a truly collaborative process. That's fantastic. We have another question from the audience. How do you continue to find ways to expand the knowledge and conversations around indigeneity? I'm sorry, I had trouble saying that right. Indigeneity throughout the Americas without Native and First Nations peoples being homogenized?
It's interesting because in the 20th century, in the 1950s, there was this moment that Native peoples, you know, we've been through a number of different, you know, namings, right? American Indians, Native peoples, First Nations, Aboriginal, as our guest audience has indicated, have been, you know, have been referred to. But in the 1950s, there were actually very aggressive relocation projects. And so I think there is this acknowledgement that there's always this tension to erase us, to like make us not continue with the way in which we understand the world. But I also think there's there's beginning to be a recognition that some of the ways that we think about things might be useful for people or might be better for people. And so, you know, one of the things that, you know, is really important for our communities is the idea that we can express sovereignty in many different ways. And one of the most important things that we're working on right now is the idea of being able to feed ourselves with nutritious foods. And so I think that the more our own people learn or invest in the knowledge that our ancestors brought forward, and, you know, they've been thinking about this stuff for thousands of years, and it's you know, and so it's that I'm not concerned that it's going to go away. Again, I refer back to my intellectual mentor, John Mohawk, who said, you know, he predicted that, you know, everybody in the Americas at some point in time will think of themselves as indigenous in the way that we do, because it's such a powerful cultural, you know, because the knowledge is so powerful. But, you know, and so that's a really good question, but we're not concerned with it any longer because of this idea, you know, and that's what this language and discourse around resurgence is all about. It's that somehow we made it through this trauma, right? But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't learn about what that trauma was, because we have to, you know, we have to really, all of us have to change, right? We have to change so that we can live without water wars, food wars, energy wars. You know, we have to, and that's, you know, that's what the Haudenosaunee were trying to do when they brought forward the Guyanagoa or the Great Law. And even law is a difficult word to unpack here, but, you know, this philosophy that we should live with it, we should live, it's like a message of peace, that we should live as peaceable people. And so, you know, it's you know, I think that we're, you know, I'm really suggesting that the art tells us that we're really able to sample from all cultures of the world. There isn't this kind of like policing of not taking other ideas in. But the broader structure, I think that umbrella structure that the way that I conceptualize reality is that, you know, all people have a right to fresh water, all people have a right to fresh air. People have a right to have a place to live, you know, and these are all the stresses that, you know, most people today, it's not a guarantee. And I think I think these things should be guarantees, right? That it shouldn't be anything anybody should stress over. You should have access to water, air, place to live, something to eat, and the medicines to take care of yourself. Just basic, right? Everybody should have that all the time. And that's basically what our cultures were organized around.
Yes, thank you so much. That actually answered kind of one of my questions about how you talk a lot about the past informing the future, and you really just explored that there. So thank you so much. We have another audience question. Can you tell us more about the juxtaposition of objects from the past with contemporary artistic production? Do you have any concerns about changing the context of historical objects? Does this pairing enhance our understanding of the historical object?
I mean, maybe the audience is referring to the use of the Iroquois pot with Roxanne Swinsel's the piece The Nap. And I mean, there were so many, there's just so much important art to actually bring forward at this period of time. And, you know, I just want to be clear that it isn't just Indigenous art, but I mean, it's about a passion, a respect, a love for anybody that is in this process of making. And so I mean, and maybe this comes out of where I'm situated because I'm at a high profile university with some of the best scientists in the world. You know, Dr. Fauci, you know, is on the faculty at Cornell, I believe. He's connected. And at the same time, you know, there's just this push towards what is science. And in the humanities, you know, it's like there's a tension there that somehow one is more important than the other. And I'm not suggesting that this is a structure that is set up by the university, but there's a natural tendency that I think there's a naturalized tendency that, you know, science is research and art is expression. And I want to shift that. I want to say art is research. And so and we have this incredible lexicon of materials and objects that we can consult as part of our research. And we set that in dialogue with this tome of oral histories and this sort of storied understanding of what these things are. And we understand this in relationship to really a very deep analysis of place. And so, you know, it's difficult to kind of transform our thinking, but we need to transform it. And so in the Americas, the great institutional space that indigenous peoples built is actually our relationship to plants. And so at Contact, all of a sudden there was this flood of amazing different kinds of plant species and foods that was all of a sudden changing the nutritional habits of people all over the world. And so, you know, we have this sustained relationship with growing. And I guess for me, like, you know, the most important illustration of this didn't actually come from the Americas, but actually came from an indigenous woman from Nepal. And she I was attending on behalf of the Indigenous Women's Network International World Hunger Conference. And she had this display, and she had 30 little packets of different kinds of rice on one side and 2 packets of rice on the other. And so the 30 packets on one side actually were different kinds of rice that one grew in relationship to how they understood the climate to be for the coming year. And so once industry became involved in farming in their communities, they couldn't get loans or they couldn't get support to grow this very delicate diversity of crops. They had to grow the monocrops. And in those crops, you know, the DNA is restructured, so they're resistant to certain things, but there was just an extreme loss of indigenous knowledge. And so around the world, there's this amazing movement, and it isn't, you know, it's like tricky on what gets defined as indigenous, but, you know, how do Europeans define themselves? You know, I mean, it's complex, you know? And so indigenous, just that word indigenous, in the context that I use it, it implies a relationship to a settler state that is imposed, right? But then what do you do with the Irish? What do you do with, you know, what's going on with food movements in Europe? I mean, so this is a complex space. What do you do with Africa, right? And so all of these, I think this is the moment that we're at, that there's just this incredibly electric discussion around indigenous globally. And so, but the artists, like I said, follow the art, because the artists were actually doing this, you know, 20, 30 years ago. And it's just like now, all of a sudden, there's like this recognition that these relationships have been established and built. And it seems like, oh, it's new. But no, what's new is our recognition of this. And so, I don't know, I think I got off track there, but you know, it, it relates somehow. So,
It happens. So we have time for one more question, and you just started to sort of explore this in your last answer. And you mentioned in your talk methodologies of reclamation, and you started to touch on that. So artists and science working together. Can you talk a little bit more about how your work and the things that you're doing fit into that methodology?
well, I think that one of the things that you recognize is that I work both as somebody that's looking at large structures, trying to understand a broader picture and where the space of indigeneity fits in a global context. And so I'm very interested in how that works. And in that, I'm very fortunate to be able to have other thinkers that are willing to have discussions with me that even science, in fact, is an imagined space. And so when we begin to rename what we think these things are, then we can begin to see how we can move within them. And so, and so I'm deeply involved in a growing project at Cornell with my colleagues in the Cornell Botanical Gardens and the Guykono Faithkeeper Steve Enoch and his people. And in a sense, we're involved in the doing process first, right? And it takes a long time to actually, when you're in that mode, to actually then back away and begin to see what it is you're doing. And so in my family, we focused on growing what we call heritage seeds. And so it took me a long time to actually bring that indigenous practice of an insistence on maintaining these heritage seeds that we inherit from our ancestors into my art world practice. It took a while to begin to think about how these two things fit together and what they are and what they mean. And so there are growers and food sovereigntists in our territories that are deeply involved in the farming aspect of it. And you can look at a wonderful film by a Cayuga filmmaker named Gary Farmer called The Gift. It's produced by the National Film Board of Canada. And you can see like a deep, that in The Gift, he talks about like, this is where you get the understanding of the deep relationship to corn in the Americas. And so, you know, with any peoples, you have to understand what they were good at, what they excelled at, what they focused on. And so we focused on plants in the Americas. We focus on that relationship to growing. And so I needed to, it just has taken me a while to understand what that is, but I'm not involved with it in a kind of dissecting way. You know, I'm not really interested in the cellular analysis of the seed. I'm interested in other relationships to it. And so I'm just putting myself into an immersive space with it. And as I continue to understand the historic underpinnings of it. And so right now for me, that's how I see it coming together. But I think, you know, Indigenous artists are working collaboratively with their communities, with other artist groups, with you know, people that specialize, like people that are more interested in, you know, other aspects of this. And so that's, I think, the big news here. It's that artists have given themselves permission to work laterally in communities, to not just work individually, but to actually see themselves as part of a larger process, as part of community. And I think at the same time, when you have a artist or a researcher or a scholar, what Indigenous peoples are very sensitive to is a model of research which is extractive. I just don't think there's any tolerance for that anymore, that you can't go in and pull something out without being reciprocal. And so what's the relationship? What are you doing in exchange? And so this is what I work with my students on, that the day is over when you get to just skim knowledge from anybody and not have to be responsible to them. And so I guess I'm trying to work at all these different levels all the time in order to better understand just this, incredibly powerful and sustaining knowledge that I do believe every culture has some form of it. And but I do feel particularly like I feel Indigenous peoples have an advantage, because especially here in a way in the Americas, because this is our place. Right? We don't have to establish a deep root, we are it. And so there's just a different way of being in the world, and so we just need to build on that strength.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Jolene. This has been a really wonderful lecture, and we look forward to sharing it with our audiences.
Yeah, thank you.
Great.